From the SABC's Auckland Park studios, hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuya Mvoko, and on the show tonight,
those who apply at the right time when they applied and they were approved, they will have to be paid and backdated to that time.
In what is hoped will lead to more people qualifying, the government has increased the threshold for the social relief of distress grant from 350 rands to 624. But how long will it take for beneficiaries to get the money in their bank accounts? We speak to the man in charge of the disbursement process.
As government, we want to confirm that the process has not been as smooth as we anticipated it to be.
Groveling apologies and frank admissions from the highest political office in the land, together with what promises that government has begun addressing the sloppiness. But are people on the ground beginning to see any evidence that things are changing for the better, months after suffering enormously following the April KwaZulu-Natal floods?
The Electoral Committee then will use these rules to vet all nominees on short lists and exclude those affected.
The ANC tightening the noose on its cadres who stand accused of corruption, but who may still harbor ambitions to be elected to the highest positions at its elective conference in December. But is that going to solve the problem? Our panelists for this evening weigh in on that and more. The Watchdog starts now. Well, more South Africans will now be in line to qualify for the Social Relief of Distress grant. This after the government increased the eligibility threshold from 350 to 624 rands, in line, of course, with the 2021 food poverty line. The SRD grant was introduced about 2 years ago during the COVID-19 pandemic to assist struggling South Africans who cope with the economic consequences of the lockdown. But of course, there was an outcry after the national state of disaster ended, after the government decided to review the arrangement, forcing people to reapply and tightening as well the criteria for people to qualify. This morning, hours after gazetting the new arrangement, Social Development Minister Lindiwe Zulu spoke to Sakina Kamwendo on our sister program, Morning Live.
We realized that we're having less people who were being approved. And the reasons why, it was because of the threshold, and therefore the regulations are a reference to lifting the amount in terms of the threshold, so that those that qualify, we get as many who qualify as they qualified in the past, because it became a bit of a problem that you had in the past have something like 15 million people applying. Of course, it goes down when you then do your processes. And then you find that with the new regulations, you almost have only about 5 million people. In fact, in some instances, some months, even less than that. Then we realized that this had everything to do with the threshold, because then people need to be approved.
Well, joining me for this conversation is Francina Nkosi, who is the coordinator for the Pay the Grants movement. Brenton van Rede is the Sassa executive manager for grants and operations. He joins us on the landline due to, of course, we all know the problem of load shedding that just hit him. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to start with you, Francina, if I may. The tampering with the eligibility criteria from 315 to 624, does that address, at the very least, the the main concern that you and like-minded NGOs and other civil society organizations have been raising over the past couple of months?
Let me start off by saying greetings to everyone and thank you for having me. The threshold, it doesn't mean anything to those who are. It doesn't mean anything to those who receive the social grant, because those who get child maintenance, they don't qualify. And we have people who are still approved, but there are no dates for them. And those people did receive their money from post office. This is another challenge also, that it's still pending and they need to rectify those mistakes first.
Assuming, I'm going to, Brenton is going to give us an update in the second, but do you see no value at all in the fact that the threshold has now been increased, which certainly according to the minister, as she was saying earlier, would mean or would translate into a lot more people being able to access this grant?
It won't. It's a little bit of a lift, but it doesn't make things better. Things are still the same. You remember this started some weeks back, but nothing have changed to make sure that people are now qualifying more than the last time. It's still the same. We still have the people who need to be back paid, but not yet. I hope if they can speed up the process and also look at how they treat this threshold. They need to look at it properly so that even if it says 624, they need to confirm that people are not working. Don't look at what somebody is sending for me. It's not mine, so that they can have proof of whether that money is yours or not. I think that way it will make a difference.
Brenton, I want to start on the very same point. The belief, you guys at Social Development believe, certainly from what the minister told us, that this move will certainly bring a lot more people or make a lot more people qualify for the grants. Tell us why, or what do you say, perhaps is the way I should ask it, what do you say to someone as skeptical as Francina?
Good evening for you and Francina, and good evening to your listeners or your viewers as well. So maybe just to correct the one statement Francina made, the threshold was published not a couple of weeks ago. It was published this week on Tuesday. So yes, you would not have seen any changes in terms of increase in applications or a number of approvals and stuff like that. In the last couple of weeks, you'll only see this filter through as we now assess the August payments. So we have, as Minister mentioned, we in the previous round of the grant we had about 15 million applications. In the current round we have about 12 million applications. We suspect that number should probably, as more people become aware of this new threshold, and obviously we do encourage people who do have incomes below the food poverty line, which is around about 624, that they do apply for the grant. But also those that have already applied, of the 12 million, one of the big concerns that we had when we or when we started doing the first set of assessments, that only about 6 million or so were approved. So of that number, we do expect also in this next round, as we do the August assessments, that we will see a larger number. So probably we're looking hopefully at about at least 1 million to 2 million and maybe even 3 million should additional people should come into the system.
Mm-hmm. If I may take you back a step, how was the 350 arrived at in the first place? Because if now the explanation is that the new threshold is in line, with the 2021 food poverty line, how then did you arrive at the 350 in the first place? Was that arbitrary, or were you forced perhaps by other considerations to arrive at that particular number?
Yes. So when the number was the first threshold was determined, it was extremely difficult to actually determine what the ideal threshold was. The only source of data we had was obviously your Stats SA survey data. And that data suggested that there was about 13 million people with no income, right? So even if we set that threshold at 0, we would already have been at a risk of overspending on this grant because we only got enough money for 10 million people. According to the Stats SA data, there's about 18 million people below the food poverty line. So if we set it at the food poverty line, just with that data that we had available at the time, we would probably overspend by double on this grant. But what we have, but remember when that threshold was implemented, government did make a commitment and say, when we implement it, we will review the uptake of the grant and then adjust the threshold if need be. And obviously, as we implemented it, we actually got a very different picture from what survey data is actually telling us. So, we've now beginning to generate what we call administrative data, which is sort of more real because it's practical what we're seeing on the ground. And immediately after, government saw that when we did those first assessments in June, I think it was early July, that the minister published new regulations for public comment, which closed at the end of July, and now mid-August they reviewed all those public comments and then published the new thresholds.
If I heard the minister correctly, from that interview that she gave to us on Morning Live this morning, she mentioned the figure of 44 billion. If I'm correct, you can confirm that number or correct me if I'm wrong. Does that number, give you the assurance that you will be able to service, everyone who potentially, at the very least, qualifies, given the new threshold that has just been gazetted?
Yes, I think we can be relative. One is never 100% certain. But I think we can be relatively confident that we have sufficient budget to cover this adjustment to the threshold. And again, I believe that there's still a continued commitment from the Department of Social Development that if this threshold still doesn't bring in the numbers that we're expecting, because we would at least want to see this grant increase to reach about 10 million people. That they will probably reconsider that threshold again.
Mm-hmm. Now, you addressed one of Francina's concerns earlier by saying that, she would not have seen the difference yet because, this new arrangement was only gazetted a couple of days ago. Tell us then what it is that you are going to do or you have done to make sure that you put things in place so that we don't see what we've been seeing over the past few months where people's get rejected and without being told, and there seemed to be, communication was far from where it should have been, given the confusion that was created, and of course the lived experiences of people throughout the period that they have had to access this grant. Take us through very briefly what you have put in place to make sure that what we've seen in the past doesn't happen again, and the concerns that people have expressed, which you know only too well. I mean, you've been on this program quite a number of times now. So take us through what you've done.
So essentially, it's still the same system. And again, just to give the context and the background, when these regulations were published in April, the announcement was actually made that for the first time we heard about the extension of the grant was mid-February, when the president announced it in his budget speech. We had to then, and the regulations published in April, which actually changed the system significantly, led us to having to develop a whole new system. Or implement a whole new part of the system, which is this testing
in the interest of time, and I'm not for a second undermining what you are saying, Brent.
Yeah.
It's just at the time. I mean, we've been through the drill and the exercise. I mean, in the past, that was the whole history and how you were. I mean, like announcements or commitments were made, perhaps without somebody ensuring that actually, you would be prepared, for like implementing those. Let's now take things where they are, with everything that we've known, everything that we have experienced, especially the beneficiaries. Are you saying that you've taken care of both their concerns, but also the other teething problems that you had? You've spoken to the banks. Everything is in order. You'll be able to pay the, little interest.
Yeah, okay. So
those kinds of things.
What I'm saying is, look, we're building and implementing and fixing and refining as we go along. The system is not yet perfect. I'm not going to lie and say everything's taken care of, everything's fixed. It would take us years to build a system like this. And we would have built, we would have piloted, we would have tested it, and then we would have implemented. We just built and implemented, and we're refining as we move along. We have come across a lot of mistakes. We have fixed a few of them. There are still some that is in production and being fixed. There were some errors made. There were some overpayments made. There were some underpayments made. And we are in the process of fixing that. This change for the April, we have already began working on what needs to be changed so that we could implement it when the regulations were published. But obviously, when new contracts, etc., needs to be signed, none of that could be signed until the actual law was put in place. But all of that has been being processed over the course of this week. So we're hoping to be able to implement this new threshold still within the course of next week to the August runs. We haven't done the July runs as yet because there was this piece in the legislation, in the previous legislation, that said you had to reconfirm after 3 months, after 3 payments, which means a lot of people would have been excluded from the grant.
Okay, I want you to park that one for a second, because I want to go back to Francina. But before I do that, have you reinforced, in other words, have you made sure that your troubleshooting mechanism, whatever it is really stronger, a lot stronger than it was before? Because whenever, part of the problem seemed to be that whenever problems arose, you weren't able to fix them timeously, certainly not to the satisfaction of even the people who thought they had come to understand both your criteria and how you were implementing the decisions that you had taken. And that's even before we got to what was gazetted on Tuesday.
So I think a lot of it is also communication. I mean, so you can't quite fix that, I mean, you can obviously fix communication, but a lot of it is just general unhappiness in the way the system runs. Like Francina mentioned, we according to the legislation, income is very blunt. It's regarded as anything that flows into your bank account. And that is simply just from a practicality point, there is no way we can do it any other way. It's either that or there wouldn't be this grant.
Well, I thought there was at least an understanding between you and the banks that that criteria doesn't work, certainly not under these circumstances.
So that's not changing. So, I mean, yes, there's going to be people that's unhappy with that, but that's not going to change. That is practically, from a practical perspective, that is the only thing we can do at this point. There is no other way to do it.
Okay.
So if you said do it differently, then we would have to say, okay, then, well, let's stop this grant, because there is no other way to do it in this particular space and environment that we're in. There is no technology. Note that this whole grant is run digitally, right? The only other way we could do it is if we start implementing face-to-face assessments. We ask people to bring their bank statements in, but we just don't have the capacity to do that. So that's not going to change, unfortunately.
Francina, are you, or from everything that Brenton has said, are you hopeful, or little more hopeful than you were before you came on the program?
Okay, I want to pass this one, is that he's talking about the face-to-face application of a person. This thing is happening at Lephalale after it was an interview with those who were declined, and that Sassa take a step of leaving their comfortable seats in the offices to go and help communities. I wish all provinces can do the same, so that people who are declined, who are approved without dates, that way it will speed up things and it will show that Sassa cares for communities. For me, that's the wish that it could. And sometimes we say we want to see actions rather than talking.
Okay.
For me, I wish that can be done.
Brenton, do you have that capacity?
So, no, we don't have that capacity. We've got about 8,000 staff in Sassa, about 6,000 are probably full-time servicing our application points. And that's to service the 13 million clients that we currently have. We got about 1 million clients that flow through our doors every year. Now, that just gives you the sense of the number of people. Just to service 1 million people, we got about 6,000 people at our application points. If we were to now suddenly service 10 million people more, you can imagine how much we would have to almost increase our capacity by tenfold. But that's not only human resources. We would need new office spaces. If we had to say go to an office, you would go to the Belleville office and you'll probably be queuing to Beaufort West, just waiting to get into that office. So from a capacity point, unfortunately we can't do it physically. And that's why this grant remains a digitally applied grant. If we wanted to do it physically, like every other grant that we've implemented, we implemented it over a period of 10 to 15 years.
Okay.
This one, we implemented it in months.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave it there for tonight. Thanks to both of you. Brenton van Vrede, who is Sassa's Executive Manager for Grants and Operations, as well as Francina Nkosi, who is a coordinator and an activist for the Pay the Grants movement. To this now, the presidency has, well, once again, apologized to victims of the floods that devastated KwaZulu-Natal. For months now, many promises of government assistance have not seen the light of day. Facing parliamentarians earlier today, Deputy President David Mabuza said they were working hard at rectifying all the problems they have since identified.
These challenges included, among others, poor coordination, integration, and sharing of capacity and resources between all the three spheres of government, that will have mitigated against inadequate identification and measurement of the extent of the damage, poor project management, including tight planning, budgeting, and execution, poor contracting, including pricing and monitoring of project delivery, inadequate risk management process, unnecessary delays caused by policy red tape, and tedious procedures when responding to disasters. All of the above, Honorable Chairperson, resulted in failure to monitor and track progress and quality of the project delivery, leaving affected communities and people highly frustrated while forced to live for a prolonged period under very unconducive conditions. To this effect, we want to take this opportunity to apologize to all affected communities and families and individuals for having subjected them to this situation for a long time. As part of remedying this situation, we'll strengthen our monitoring mechanism, identify implementation capacity gaps, and work with the provinces to close the gaps while creating synergies across the entire value chain to ensure that people are assisted as promptly as possible. We are committing to remedying the situation by ensuring that we urgently put an end to the misery currently faced by our communities, our families, and individuals affected by the flood. We are going to do this by strengthening intergovernmental coordination between the three spheres of government, ensuring that intergovernmental capacity with agency to restore livelihoods and improve services to all communities, especially in eThekwini and other affected municipalities within a set time frame. Making sure that national, provincial, and municipal leadership commit to take urgent actions within strict specified dates. Ensure that suitable preventative controls are identified, strengthened, and implemented as a matter of urgency so that we can avoid wastages, corruption, and failure of infrastructure rebuilding phase on a set timeline.
But are the people of KwaZulu-Natal seeing any difference on the back of those acknowledgements? Are they seeing any evidence as to whether indeed the government has learnt its lessons? Well, among the people who have been following this process very closely, civil society group, Abahlali Base Mjondolo, whose president, Sbu Zigode, joins us on the line from Durban. Sbu, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Let me ask you first, as a stakeholder, do you accept the Deputy President's apology? Sbu, can you hear us? Okay, looks like Sbu's line is frozen. It's been the story of our lives this evening. Load shedding, the lines freezing. Hopefully, we will be able to get to Sbu in a short while. We're going to take a quick ad break, and after the break, if we don't get Sbu, we'll move on to that ANC story. We spoke to you about the party tightening the noose on its cadres who stand accused of corruption. That story coming up in a moment. Don't go away. Well, on the back of the acknowledgements made earlier by the Deputy President, David Mabuza, that they are aware of the problems with regards to helping the victims of the floods, are people on the ground seeing the difference, given what the Deputy President said in Parliament today, that they have started working on some of the problems? Civil society group, Abahlali Basem Jondolo, who's President Sbu Zikode, joins us now on the line, have been watching this process very, very closely. Sbu, I hope this particular line will hold. The question I was asking you earlier was whether, first, you accept the Deputy President's apology.
Good evening, Vio, and your viewers at home. Thank you for having us. Unfortunately, Vio, it would be a slap on the faces of the victims of the floods if I were to come here and accept the apology that has been deliberately made. Nobody would have been, no one would have imagined that, people would be staying in community shelters, halls, and so on for 4 months at least without government intervention. So I would not lie. The Deputy President's apology is not acceptable, and it is very difficult for people on the ground to actually accept such apology, given the living conditions under which they are subjected to.
Well, he says he told Parliament that, he listed a whole set of problems and then ended by saying that they have begun remedying the situation. As people who are on the ground, have you seen any evidence of that? In other words, are things beginning to look any better from where you sit?
Not really, Rio. In fact, the situation is getting worse. It is getting out of hand. As I speak to you now, almost every day, flood victims in many parts of KwaZulu-Natal are threatened with evictions. Some have already been evicted, and some communities have had to go to court in order to be reinstated back into those shelters. As I speak to you today, the Ethekwini municipality has been threatening some of the flood victims in Entlungwane, in Inanda, as we speak, giving them 5 days to vacate the hall without really explaining or giving the community members any alternative, space to live. All the promises that were made have now been broken. Nobody wants to take responsibility, but it's getting worse in a sense that there isn't any hope that is being restored to people. Instead, people are threatened with being evicted in these, shelters in which they live.
So all we can say is I'm sure a lot of South Africans empathize with the people who are affected, and hopefully the government will deliver on the promises that were made by the Deputy President today as he was addressing Parliament. A story, of course, will continue monitoring here on the program, but also on other programs across SABC platforms. To this now, the door has been shut on the suspended ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule to return as a leader of the party. All ANC leaders who have been charged with crimes and were hoping that the National Conference will bring them back have had their hopes dashed by the Electoral Committee guidelines. Chairperson of the ANC's Electoral Committee, former party Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, says the National Conference in December cannot amend or discard the guidelines that have been set.
A once buoyant and determined Ace Magashule called on party members to remain focused and to work to remove elected leaders of the ANC at the 2022 National Conference. The Radical Economic Transformation faction in the ANC had suffered a crushing defeat to Cyril Ramaphosa in 2017. Magashule had attempted to encourage party members to remain focused on recapturing the governing party.
So stay focused. My boy, ANC, it's just a matter of 5 years. It's a matter of 5 years. It's a matter of 5 years, comrade. Conferences happen after each and every 5 years.
5 years later, it would be Magashule who was suspended by the party, along with other leaders of the ANC who are facing charges related to serious crimes. Some who were hoping that the National Conference would dispense the step-aside resolution and the Electoral Committee guidelines may find their hope extinguished.
Once it convenes and the credentials are adopted, it is a structure. And that is why, in its own right, it's a structure. And it conducts its business in accordance with the Constitution as amended by the previous conference and the rules of conference. So these rules would apply, and conference would only adapt them for the future and or amend them for the future, but not for the running of conference itself. So there's no room for conference to scupper them. Once that happens, that would be the end of the ANC, because it would mean that every conference will develop its own rules. But it works on the basis of rules developed by previous conferences.
Members who have temporarily been suspended and are waiting the outcome of a court case or hearing will not be able to stand for leadership positions.
Any member in good standing who, with 10 years of unbroken service in the ANC, qualifies to be nominated and also to nominate whomsoever. So any member may stand if an active has been active for at least 10 years, then you qualify to stand for nomination onto the National Executive Committee, unless they have been found guilty of or charged with unethical or immoral conduct, any serious crime or corruption.
The governing party's branch nominations for the December elective conference will begin on the 7th of September. Some regions like Ekurhuleni are on the back foot due to internal divisions and members rejecting the leadership due to the issue of the 19 quarantined votes. Samkele Masego, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Oh, joining me now to weigh in on this latest development are political analysts Asanda Ngwasheng and Ongama Mtimka. Good evening to both of you. Thanks very much for your time. If I may start with you, Ongama, just your thoughts. I mean, having listened to what Kgalema Motlanthe had to say there.
Good evening, viewer and your viewer. I think that the ANC has given itself a fighting chance here. Looking at the attempts made to try and strengthen institutions since the Mangaung conference, I think that both in the Nasrec conference, where changes were made to try and give tooth to the Integrity Commission, and then the idea of an electoral committee, kind of presented the party and with an opportunity to strengthen processes, and I think that it attempted to improve candidate selection processes in the elections leading up to 2021. And I think that the Electoral Committee did have some impact there, even though that process was fraught with challenges. Where I've critiqued the ANC the most has been not in creating, rules for candidates to be selected for office, but rather in the blatant disregard for how crooks managed to escape the categories or the qualifying criteria that was set, and the party with each institutional process developed never got the hang of that. So what I appreciate about what they've done now is that for every known tendency to manipulate processes, to do all sorts of things that usurp the power of the branches, there has been a plan, which was announced today. And I think that opening itself up for open campaigns is going to go a long way into helping the party to finally deal with some of the undesirable tendencies that result in leaders, getting into office when they should not.
For you, Asanda Ngwasheng?
I think that the ANC is in a very desperate situation where they essentially have to try and show themselves to be a united party that is still in control, that still has a center that holds. And the sad truth of it is that they're not in control, and there are so many bits and pieces of factions and factionalism that it's difficult to actually even understand the people who are going to be voting, exactly which ANC they're going to be voting for, and based on which ideologies versus which ideologies. And the disintegration of the center has led to a situation where the ANC is constantly bringing out, they've brought out Thabo Mbeki, they're bringing out Kgalema Motlanthe, and all the people that can hanker back to a time where the ANC had some semblance of sanity and some semblance of cohesion and cohesiveness. And we're seeing that because of this lack, they're trying to present a clear picture. But when you look at the reality, you've got Ace Magashule, who's fighting very hard to be on that slate. You've got all of these people, including Mabuza, for example, who's the current deputy president, who are all fighting to be on the slate, but are all charged or have some kind of allegations of corruption. And it's going to be interesting to see the reality versus what Kgalema Motlanthe has stated is going to be the case.
Well, isn't contestation part of politics, though? Asanda, in other words, you are going to see a contestation even in situations where perhaps they may have been together. Ideologically, even in situations where perhaps there weren't as many factions and there weren't too many rifts between the opposing factions.
I think that it's one of those situations where under normal circumstances or circumstances where there is cohesion, it would be okay for us to see some differences in ideology and different, sides of the argument trying to prove or speak to what they most stand for. But what we're seeing right now is a situation where people are going to vote, and even within the two slates, if you think about it as RET versus the New Dawn, there's the Taliban, and there's all these other kind of breakaway bits and pieces of factions. And then you've got this kind of giant shadow figure called Jacob Zuma, who features quite prominently, even though he's already had his term in the presidency, but he features quite prominently and still seems to have some kind of iron fist control of some kind in KZN. And those are all kind of question marks that haven't been solved. And as I said, you've got your Ace Magashules, you've got your David Mabuzas, you've got, the people like Supra trying to come back and show himself to still be ready for leadership. And you've got Paul Mashatile, who's a very interesting character that keeps popping up, and you're not quite sure exactly where he fits in and which side he is or isn't. And so there's too many things going on and too many different bits and pieces and breakaways for there to be some level of cohesion. And I think what we're likely to see even in terms of the voting is these bits and pieces are going to lead to a very much broken piecemeal kind of result or resolution at the December conference itself. I don't think we're going to see as clear-cut a win as we saw in the last election where Cyril Ramaphosa was quite clearly and his slate leading. I think it's going to be a kind of piece that is going to be difficult to manage post-December, because the question is, of course, everybody can last up until December, but what happens after December? Mm-hmm. Who is going to, is the dog going to wag its tail? Who is going to lead? On what ideology, on what basis, on what support? Because there's always this question, even now, that Cyril Ramaphosa is the president of the country, but if you listen to ANC people, they will talk as if they're not in support of him, and so you don't know who exactly is leading, on what basis, who supports him, who doesn't, and it's kind of, I think it's one of the murkiest, and the most divided and the most incoherent ANC we've ever seen. And the ANC actually has always been a broad church and has always kind of been more center in terms of politics and managed to bring these different people from communists to, unionists to capitalists together. But somehow I think the center is not holding, and all those pieces are not coming together coherently in the ways that they have before. And I think part of it is because the ANC itself can't agree on what its, 2024 going forward identity is. And that is going to have an impact on voters' ability to trust them, to lead them, because they are not even showing us any sense of, being behind the current leadership. And so what hope do we have that they'll be behind whatever leadership emerges out of December, which is likely to be a kind of patch of the different factions?
Okay. Asanda has already gone beyond December, but I want to take you back to before December in the few seconds we have left. By giving them credit for at least trying to deal with the problems that are confronting it and perhaps derailing them, you're not at all suggesting that between now and December, this matter is actually or has been dealt with. In other words, no one over the next few months is going to try, all the way to the elective conference, is going to try and push back against this very same issue.
So two things there. One, in terms of the authority that the Electoral Committee derives, it derives it from the last conference as well as the latest National Executive Committee meeting. I was quite surprised at the blank check that they seem to have been given to, one, come up with rules for campaigning, come up with qualifying criteria, and then also something which I think we are not yet seeing and has been done here and puts this electoral committee in a very powerful position is the idea that who qualifies for leadership, one is going to be screened and vetted by them. A process which was not there before, because remember, as a matter of procedure, through the eye of the needle would be read, when branches make nominations. But the Electoral Committee has given itself power to vet the names coming from provinces. And in fact, the parameters within which it's going to do that are beyond the what has determined who gets to step aside, who does not. They have gone back to the ANC constitution in saying candidates are going to not just be measured on the basis of whether or not they have been forced to step aside in terms of the rule of step aside, but also in terms of the broader Rule 25 of the ANC Constitution, in terms of which questions of morality and ethics are going to form part of it, as well as the person likely to bring a party into disrepute. So what we're going to see here is the emergence of a very strong committee and they've got the right political capital to become that because they've been given the mandate. And people, I think we are oversimplifying it when we are saying it only affects Ace Magashule and others, because any development that may happen to raise, for example, the profile of the president, the seriousness of the president's current shenanigans, may just trigger one of the determinations there that somebody is actually most likely going to bring the party into disrepute and therefore may not qualify for election.
In fact, in fact, I mean, Asana, in the 30 seconds we have left, that very same point that Ongama just made, the likelihood of a lot of people like really using the whole Pala, saga in the months left, going to a conference to really, pursue the agenda of pushing back. I mean, only yesterday you had opposition parties talking about how they are going to engage civil society, but also a motion of no confidence and all those things. So those who have vested interest in undoing what Kgalema Motlanthe just said today, holding on to the whole Pala saga to actually dislodge Cyril Ramaphosa. 30 seconds.
I think that, the problem that we have is that we have very few innocent people and a majority of corrupt people, or at the very least accused of corruption or charged with corruption. And so it's very difficult to have these rules that say if you are charged, accused of, etc., you cannot stand, because that's literally wipes out most of the people in the current NEC, most of the people in the current cabinet, and most of the people who are ordinary members of the ANC who have had some kind of, official position at any stage. And so they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot in one way, while I understand that they're trying to show themselves to be serious about corruption and to be serious about getting their house in order. But I think it's really too little, too late, and 2024 is going to cost them a lot, and all the mistakes that they've made in the past 5 years are going to haunt them.
Asanda Ngwashengo, Ngabam Team, let me thank both of you for your time and insights this evening.
Thank you.
And that's our show for tonight. To join us again tomorrow evening, same time.